Yeah, I think it was when I was a child, early on, probably when I was 7 years old, I began to realize I just think differently than everybody else. And it was really kind of a peculiar thing where I just realized that I didn't think like my parents. I didn't think like my friends. I didn't think like most of the people that I knew, even the people I went to church with. And I just had a very, very different view of the world. And, for decades now, even today, I puzzle over why do I think so differently compared to everybody else? And it often makes it very difficult for me to make friends. For example, I realized that is challenging. I do have friends. That's not something that it's not necessarily something that you might look at me and be like, "Oh, for him," that's not what I'm saying, is that, I just think so differently than everybody else, and I often feel like I can see through what often people's their intentions are. Um, I don't really like to mince words so much, but I'm very afraid to sort of tell that in a very direct way. I don't necessarily, but I realize like people view me often as strange in many ways, right? Like I had that sense for a tremendous long time, and there's two ways I could sort of see this and understand it. Um, for a long time, I thought it was because that, I was sheltered for a long time. So with my family, I grew up in a large family, but my parents really didn't do a lot of. We did a lot of stuff in our church, and we would um, be doing things with their church, but that meant often I was just hanging out with my family that was there. I was in the Roman Catholic Church. Um, and then and it was just like the people I did hang out with were people in my family. But I realized I was really different than my siblings even. I saw the world completely different than my siblings. And um and it was like, sometimes a point of contention because I just don't view the world in the sort of very straight way that I think lots of people view it as. Um and to give you an example of what I'm talking about, when I often see the world, I don't see the things that people get very emotionally attached to. And I don't have the same emotional attachment to it. I often see, if people talk about things that are natural, for example, I highly discount that. Because I often see the world as full of elements and full of pieces that work together. There's not necessarily a single sort of natural thing, for example. Um, or the one of the things I've noticed is that I have a peculiar sense of being able to persist at something for a long time. And that is beyond what most people are able to. It's very peculiar sense because even people that are very, very bright tend not to do the same sort of, uh, persisting at something. But I'm not stubborn in the sense that people might think about, or, kind of a blockhead, or, mean or anything like that, that you might think about. But, I have a desire and I understand the sort of power of persistence, but that is extraordinarily weird with what everybody else views the world. And I don't often view the world in the same sort of sense of, well, I can't do that. Right. Like I know that part of my brain is turned off where, if I was to set my mind to it, I would at least try. I would be that weird person. If I wanted to go to the Olympics, for example, I would try, but I would never get into the Olympics, but I would try for my whole life. I think it's interesting when I understand that. So on one side of this sort of puzzling over things, I've realized um, over the course of having kids that first of all I have ADHD, and I think I probably have dyslexia at the same time. Probably a very mild case of dyslexia, and so my whole I've definitely a very probably particularly pronounced, but not debilitating, case of ADHD, but not the way that most people think about it as sort of running around bouncing off the walls, but um, as somebody that easily that sort of struggles to put things together in a very coherent way quickly. I've never been one to, if you're in a group of people, when there's more than 3 or 4 people, I can't follow the conversation most of the time unless I'm highly engaged. Um, and it's often very difficult, so I can't often be participating in the conversation. If there's distractions, for example, like loud music, like good luck, it's not going to happen. I'm not going to participate. I just can't pay attention. I can't follow along. So definitely have some very pronounced forms. Since I never really liked going out at night because of this, because it's just so difficult. Um, to carry on conversations or pay attention. But, you know, what I realized is that so that's on one negative side of things, right? The negative side is I got all of these deficiencies and all of these, you know, problems, I guess, that sort of set me up. But, a positive take on these is I know how to persist. And that's always been part of me because to keep up, I've had to work 2, 3 times as hard as everybody else. I remember, one of the things that people did in graduate school is they skimmed readings. I cannot skim readings. If it's 30 pages, I have to read 30 pages to understand what's actually going on. Um, and I can't comprehend what is actually going on unless I fully understand something and I understand all of the ins and outs, which makes it great for me to go into depth. Um, but it actually is not very great for my profession because successful people in my profession don't do that. They often, quote unquote, successful people in my profession, they sort of get a cursory understanding broadly and move on to the next thing. And I can't put words together extraordinarily quickly, like some people can. Um, so there's all these deficiencies, right? Like quote unquote deficiencies. But on the other side of it, um, I've also realized that I have extraordinarily high intelligence in some ways. Um, maybe not necessarily in terms of putting words together, but I think weirdly. And people will tell me that, and I just have a weird way of putting things together. But in my mind, it is very much, it all makes sense, right? Like people, if I'm participating in kind of a seminar, my mind will be like very quirky. But to me, I sort of see these patterns that other people cannot see in a research seminar, and they just don't see it, right? It's not necessarily something that they will ever see. So that in of itself, I realized, if you sort of look at the problems of high intelligence, you realize that some of these things actually overlap, that you do feel out of place often. You really can't communicate in a way, right? Like sometimes people get confused ADHD and high intelligence in the classroom because that they often have been told that you hear the story that they're so extraordinarily smart that they're kind of bored in the classroom. They distract everybody. So what I'm getting at with all of this is that what you'll realize, and everybody has their own particular thing. And what you'll realize in this world is that uh, the way that normal people, quote unquote, normal people think or at least the presumption of how normal people think. It's an imagined construct that neglects all of the interesting nuances that all of us actually have. And we all have either, quote unquote deficiencies. And I think that's actually really bad medicine and bad science to sort of view the world in that way. I think I would be very harsh on that. Um, because it sort of views the world as, that there is a normal template. But when you look at the world and you start breaking it down into different ways, you realize that many of us feel these kind of things. And in particular, people that push the needle in different areas, um, that they often don't have the same views as everybody else. And what you'll realize is that there's nothing wrong with that. There's no deficit. It's not wrong to have high intelligence, and I don't think I have such high intelligence that I'm really weirdly out there, right? I probably have, I'm probably at the 99th percentile, but I'm not, well over that kind of thing. Um, but what I'm getting at is that we all have these sort of things that are going on, and even if you have an observable disability, um, that people would say that's a problem. What you realize is that many of those people have some really extraordinary gifts that we often can't see or that we downplay, um, often, right? That there is something that's beautiful that's actually there. And part of why we actually do these kind of trickery things to think about what is the normal way of doing things, it's often just because of the deficiencies of science. We don't have very good tools to look at nuance across um, across the spectrum and come up with a good way to understand that. Right? It just doesn't really exist. We have some very basic tools of mathematics that have existed for a long time, but it's based on classifying things into groups. But we don't have good stories or ways of doing things other than through storytelling of what it means to look at the world in a lot more nuance. So storytelling and narrative is an actual sciencey kind of way of doing things, but it doesn't have the same impact often of what people think is true hardcore science. The fact that I actually bring up myself a lot often gets people to think, well, that's just opinion, but it's not. This is actually people doing good science in their own life by thinking about the world in a very critical way. And I encourage you, instead of thinking about all of the issues about how you don't belong or you're strange or unusual, because we all have something like that. Instead of that, think about how beautiful that you actually are. Think about how interesting and amazing and how much you actually contribute to a conversation because you are unusual, because it actually doesn't just build on what everybody else does. So I think that's my thoughts today is even though that we all have something, don't worry about it so much. You don't have to have a cause for why things happen. You just have to realize that you add to a beautiful mosaic in this world. Take care.